So welcome to session 6. Joining us on stage, we have John Ross, author and historian. Some of you have heard from John last night at the opening session. Jay Famiglietti is executive director of the Global Institute of Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan. Rob Jernigan, co-regional managing principal for the Southwest for Gensler. Trevor Hauser, partner with the Rhodium Group and co-director of the Climate Impact Lab. And lastly, our moderator, Duke Reiter. No introduction necessary. Take it away, Duke.
Thanks, Cece. And for those of you who have said some very nice things to me about how things are going, and I really appreciate that, but I wanted to let you know, of course, this would not be possible without an incredible crew. Some of you heard me introduce them last night about one you've already been introduced to. So Cecilia Rivera has been behind the scenes making all the the flights available to you, the field trips, so much of the organization of this. Jamie Hogue, who just slipped out of the room, making sure these panels are well coordinated. Kate Carefoot, who's been working on the overall construction of this for about 6-7 months. Melissa McCann, who is behind the scenes helping to bring audiences to this, making sure we have great outreach. And then Sabina Butler. If you have not met Sabina, she's often at the front desk. We are all indebted to her. So I hope you appreciate the professionalism that they're bringing to this. And if you have a chance to thank them, I hope that you do. You might want to give them a round of applause now. So someone described this morning as being intensely about communities and knowing what's going on there and the information that can be gained from face-to-face communications in communities, in cities, cross state borders, whatever it might be. And that's all true. That's one kind of truth, if you will. There's a second kind of truth that can come from the use of technologies that are giving us access to information that make it sort of hard for us not to act, not to respond in some way. So you're going to hear about things dedicated to the topic of evidence. We're going to start with my friend Jay, then Trevor, and we're going to conclude with Rob, who's going to explain how a designer looks at a city and its carrying capacity. I've invited my friend John Ross back to the stage. Many of you heard him last night. It was his book, which is an inspiration for a lot of what's going on at this conference, and John Wesley Powell's map, which was a century ahead of its time in terms of presenting evidence. So that's how we've organized this. John will be a respondent, not a presenter today, and we're going to let each of these gentlemen present their work, and then we'll all sit down, talk about it a bit, and open things up for questions earlier than normal, because I think you're going to have quite a few. So with that, Jay, you're up.
Thank you very much, Duke. Okay, so I want to cover some material that I just published in a magazine by the Pew Charitable Trust. The magazine's called Trend. I think we have some free copies available.
Which is available out front.
The whole issue is on water, and so this work is sort of a translation of the work that I've been doing with the NASA satellite called GRACE, which stands for Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment, for much of the last 20 years. I'll talk about what satellites are telling us about regional and global water availability and how it's changing. What are some of the implications for the I-10 corridor, and then some points for discussion, although we've already hit on quite a number of them. So the map is shown here, and we're looking at a map that shows us how freshwater availability, all of the snow, surface water, soil moisture, groundwater together, has changed over the last 15 or so years, again, from this satellite mission. The blue colors are gaining water, and the red colors are losing water. And so there's a strong, let me just explain it to you, there's a strong climate change component that's shown here. Hold on. Along the top, the high latitudes, that's not really showing up that well, but high latitudes, so are increasing, the low latitudes are increasing, and in between, there's a fair amount of drying that's going on. That's mostly driven by climate change. We see the ice sheets are melting away. So what are some of these red spots? Ice sheets are melting away. The glaciers are melting away. Okay, there's the climate change signal of the high latitudes getting wetter, and the mid latitudes getting drier. There's a fair amount of interannual variation that shows up here, meaning we're starting to see the intensity, the changing intensity and frequency of flooding and drought start to show up in some of these maps. But a lot of those red hotspots we're looking at are aquifers, and so this issue of groundwater and groundwater depletion is one that is not going to go away on its own. And so we've had some discussion on that yesterday and today. So just to mention a few of these aquifers that are being depleted, we've got the Central Valley Aquifer in California, the Ogallala. As we cross over into the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, the upper tier of the Middle East, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, across the northwestern India into Bangladesh, the North China Plain, northwestern Australia, that's the Pilbara region, and down in South America, the Huarni Aquifer, just above the southern tip. And so, in fact, over half of the world's major aquifers, there are 37 major aquifers in the world that the WMO and the UN recognizes, and over half of them are being depleted. Okay? So our water security is at risk, our food security is at risk, because most of that water is being used to grow food. Right? Irrigation provides, groundwater provides about 50% of the water used for irrigated agriculture. Okay, let's see what else we have here. I don't know where I should be pointing this. I'll just try this. Oh, you know what? I was hitting the laser pointer. That's why it wasn't advancing. Okay, let's focus in on the United States. If you look at the U.S., very much the upper half is getting wetter, the lower half is getting drier. There are some real hot spots there for groundwater depletion in the Central Valley, for groundwater depletion in the southern part of the Ogallala, and that big blue spot there in the upper Missouri and up into Calgary, which is seeing an awful lot of flooding, and it's happening right now. Oh, you know, did you mention that I moved to Canada? And I just wanted to say that our cold there is much more pleasant than your cold. So let's look at some of the time series. Let's go along the I-10. Let's go along the I-10 corridor. And so here's LA. So we're looking at now, it's like looking at the total amount of water. Again, all of the snow, surface water, soil, moisture, groundwater together, and how it's changing. So we see our ups and downs, but we see that downward trend. So that was sort of around this area, sort of Phoenix, Tucson, and then El Paso, right? So all sort of showing the same. You know, I think I put the same graphic on here twice. My mistake. But El Paso doesn't look that much different than Phoenix and Tucson. Let's go across now. We're in Houston. And I just want to point out, so those ups and so there's a downward trend, but the ups and downs are much, much bigger. And that's wet season, dry season. That's flood, drought, okay? Much bigger. You can't see, it's like an order of magnitude greater on the Y scale. And same thing there, that's sort of the Mobile area. So lower half of the country is getting drier. Groundwater is being depleted. When you look at the western half, the southwestern U.S., very dry and sort of declining. The eastern half, a lot more ups and downs, but still drying. Colorado River Basin came up in discussion. You know, I just want to show, this is some work that we did a few years ago. I just want to show this graphic here that shows the ratio. You know, we don't really talk too much about groundwater. Those of you who were at the reception last night might have noticed that I did my best to stay under control. But, you know, it's because of this panel here in the lower right that shows the surface water versus groundwater use in the lower basin, okay? And so what we're looking at in red is Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Relatively flat, even though we know those, right, they're dropping, right? But when you plot groundwater at the same scale, that's what we estimate in blue. So this is for all of the lower basin, not just the managed parts, but the whole lower basin. Groundwater is disappearing at a rate of about 7-to-1 compared to what we see in Lake Powell and Lake Mead. That's a tough message to deliver, but I just delivered it. California, long-term picture in California. This is going back to 1962. Colors in the background represent either very dry and tan, or very wet in blue, or moderately wet, moderately dry, and light blue and light tan. Groundwater's been disappearing for a long time, going back to 1962, and the blue at the end gets to our satellite estimates, and they lay right on top of the USGS observation. So that's not a pretty picture there in California. I'll skip over that lovely animation. I want to talk about subsidence. So this is actually a famous photograph of USGS hydrogeologist Joe Poland standing next to a telephone pole in whatever year that is, 1977. On that telephone pole is marked where the surface was in whatever that is, 25. So it's about 50 feet of subsidence in about 50 years. Subsidence happens in some aquifers that have a lot of clay minerals. And when you pump the groundwater out, the aquifers flatten out and the ground sinks. So here's some evidence not from the GRACE mission, but from Reiter. The upper is showing, we're in this region here in the box, so east of the Bay Area. The upper figure is showing subsidence from 2007 to 2011, rates up to about a foot per year in the middle. And in the really serious part of the drought there, in California, the rates were up to about 1.5 feet per year or more subsidence, so ground sinking, okay? So of course, any thing that's on top of that, any infrastructure, any roads, canals, are an issue. Relative sea level rise, if you're on the coast, is of course an issue. So there's Joe in 77, and if we sort of Photoshop in what's been happening, we went from there to there. Okay, so it's not good. That's an area that's sort of looking at different regions along the I-10 corridor, if you can just focus on the southern half of regions that are vulnerable to subsidence. So it's not just an isolated California thing. Okay, what are some of the implications for the 10X corridor, the I-10 corridor? We've talked about a lot of these, right? Sea level rise, we're talking about managed migration. Right, we're already talking about that. Changing water availability, the southern half of the country is getting drier. So please remember that. We've got those big hot spots, and we're getting, the eastern half of the southeast. I showed you that the ups and downs, the swings between wet and dry are much bigger, okay? In California, we were telling the water managers to manage to the extremes because the extremes are changing. Groundwater depletion, of course, major threat. Don't know how we're going to grow our food without groundwater. As Catherine was talking about, we need to really preserve that groundwater for the long term because it really should be a buffer. But we're sort of past drought in many of these places. We're into chronic water scarcity, so we really have to balance how we do things and really understand what's renewable, what's not renewable, and really think carefully about how we use that water and how we want to preserve it. I'm taking up too much time. We've talked about a lot of this stuff. Let me just finish with this. There's this drier water future to the southwest and this more variable and drying water future to the southeast. So we have to be preparing for that. Do we have sustainable funding in place for emergency response and for disaster relief? Someone was talking about that this morning. I forgot who it was, but this is a big issue because if we're going to be hit by flood, drought, we have to have time to recover financially as well as physically. So, of course, there's all kinds of civil infrastructure upgrades that are required, emerging humanitarian and societal issues, the haves and the have-nots, right? The lack of access, the displaced populations, the managed migration, the unmanaged migration, the climate refugees. Are we prepared for all this? I don't think we're really prepared for some of those images that I showed you. And the need for regional and national water planning. So yesterday was a great example, I think, of the Colorado River Basin, about how there was opportunities. We heard a lot about collaboration. That's fantastic. And so we need to be doing more in that regard. It could be done. So we've got free copies of the magazine, and just my personal website is just my name, and I want at least one new Twitter follower. That's the only payment I require. Okay. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in Arizona in March anyway. I'm going to do a couple of things with my 5 to 10 minutes here. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the way we apply evidence in doing climate research at the Climate Impact Lab, talk about some of our findings as are relevant to the I-10 corridor, and then provide a little bit of insight into how we think about communicating evidence-based research, how to make it applicable and usable by a non-research audience. So the Climate Impact Lab is a multi-institutional collaboration between my company, Rhodium Group, University of Chicago, University of California, Berkeley, and Rutgers University. And what we stood this up about 5 years ago to try to provide evidence-based, localized estimates of the economic impact of climate change. So to do that, we pulled together an interdisciplinary team of climate scientists and economists and data engineers, because the quantities of data that we're working with are so large. The first 2 years of the project was just getting the climate scientists and the economists to talk to each other. And then the third year was getting the economists to figure out how to actually work together and not fight. But after 3 years, we turned to core research and have started publishing that first for the US and are expanding to cover the rest of the world. The way we do this research is taking advantage of advances in cloud computing. We comb through terabytes of historical weather data and different socioeconomic output data to try to identify evidence-based relationships, whether it's between temperature and corn yields, or precipitation and violent crime rates, or hurricane activity and coastal damage. And we take those and we put them into these what are called damage functions, dose response functions if you're in the public health community. So for every dose of temperature, for every dose of precipitation, what kind of response would you expect to see in different parts of the economy? And then we map those dose response functions to climate projections from all of the leading global climate models developed by research teams around the world to help individual communities understand what the impact of changes in the climate that have already occurred are for their communities, as well as changes that are projected going forward under a range of different emission scenarios. And what we find in that research is that the impact of climate change depends very much on where you live, what your starting climatology is, and the composition of your local economy. So to take a couple examples here, agricultural production and immortality, what we see in the data is that agricultural yields increase with temperature up to a certain point. There's a sweet spot for every crop in terms of its growing temperature. And then beyond that, they crater. And there are very different response functions if you're in an irrigated part of the country versus a non-irrigated part of the country, right? So non-irrigated crop production is much more vulnerable to temperature increases than irrigated crop production is. And so when we map that damage function to commodity crop production in the US, we find 20 to 30% projected declines in commodity crop production by mid-century in some of the most vulnerable Midwest counties, and 15 to 20% crop yield increases in more northern parts of the US and in Canada. That has important implications for the water community, and that for these, particularly in the South, for parts of the southeast US that are facing that kind of production decline, they're going to have to decide whether they move to irrigation to offset, to maintain the crops that they're currently producing. That'll no longer be viable without irrigated supply. The same type of heterogeneity when you look at the impact of temperature on people, not just crops. Up to a certain temperature, climate change is beneficial in terms of mortality rates. I grew up in Wyoming. Very few people die of heat stroke in Wyoming. Lots of people pass out in snowbanks drunk. And so climate change will meaningfully decrease the mortality rate in Wyoming, will massively increase mortality rates along the I-10 corridor. And that's what you can see here. This is green in this map is projected declines in mortality rates, and red is projected increase in temperature-related mortality rates. And again, that's totally a function of where you're starting on that climate spectrum. So we value this. We do this sector by sector of the economy: violent crime rates, property crime, hurricane damage, climate-driven changes in labor productivity, in energy costs, and we value them. And what emerges is that what the cost of climate change will be for the US depends entirely about what part of the US you're talking about. So for the sectors that we've been able to quantify so far, we find a net increase in economic output in Maine and Washington of up to 2 to 3% of local income, and a net decline in economic output of 25% or larger in certain counties, particularly along the I-10 corridor, which is by far the most vulnerable part of the US to climate, and that is due primarily to that geographic positioning and where starting temperatures are. So how do we communicate this research? First, we found that local presentation of results is incredibly important in engaging people, right? The climate community, particularly climate economics, has traditionally talked about the impacts of climate change in abstract, geographically aggregate terms, like the percent of US GDP or the percent of global GDP. Nobody lives at a global average. Nobody lives at a US average. What you need to know is what is it going to mean for where I live and where I work. So for example, when we published this research in the US, the vast majority of the attention was on those localized results. So that was the first takeaway, is that you have to communicate research that's resonant to where people live. We've dug into that a little bit as we've expanded in our global research and provided tools that allow people to quickly and easily explore what climate change means specifically for where they live. So there's an example of this that you can pull up on your phones, a project we did with the New York Times, which is at nytimes.com/hometown-heat. You can put in the city you were born in, anywhere in the world, the year you were born, and it will show you how extremely hot days have evolved over the course of your lifetime to date and how they're projected to change going forward. And we've had enormous success from that location-based presentation of research results. It engages people in a way that aggregate statistics or peer review papers just can't. The other thing that we've learned is you have to, as a research provider, be ready to respond quickly to extreme weather-related events where there's a window where people are trying to engage in this information and are focused on it in the press. So after Hurricane Maria, we conducted research within a couple of weeks on the economic costs of hurricanes for island economies. Research that was then used by the Puerto Rico Fiscal Oversight Board and thinking about how to restructure debt for Puerto Rico going forward to try to size how big of a long-term cost it would have on the economy. And then one of the things we're learning is that it's really important to find the ways to engage an audience that might not really matter from an aggregate economic standpoint, right? The ski industry is completely insignificant in the US economy. It doesn't matter at all. If we wiped skiing off the map tomorrow, it would not even show up in economic statistics. It turns out some people really like skiing. They think about it a lot. They're very passionate about it. And so we've tried to find areas where what is a thing that people really care about that is climate sensitive, and how can we communicate and engage them through that, whether it's the projected decline in the number of days below freezing in their favorite ski area, or the impacts of climate change on marathon times, which is a project we did before the New York Marathon a couple of years ago, where we found that climate adjusted, actually, humans have already broke the 2-hour marathon, right? If we were in the climate of 1980, still today, some of what are now 2-hour 2, 2-hour 3 marathon times would have been sub 2-hour marathon times. Again, does not matter for the economy whatsoever. It does not matter for the vast majority of humans whatsoever. If you're like one of those extreme avid obsessed runners, this will engage you in a way that other research just won't. This is one of the big challenges we've had in our research collaboration, is taking a bunch of academic researchers, producing evidence-based, peer-reviewed science, but then figuring out, okay, how do you translate that and make it accessible by normal human beings who are hungry for engaging with this data? So those are just a couple examples, and we can dig into any more of that in the Q&A if people are interested.
Thank you, Trevor. Rob.
So I'm here today to makers. Can you hear me now? There you go. All right. So I'm here, as I said, to represent the designers, the implementers, and the makers, right? We have to take everything that you're talking about, and we have to put that into our thinking with our design solutions, because we're the ones who make cities, and we're the ones who make buildings, right? The question is, how do we have a voice at this table? And it's not just the water table, but it's the energy table. It's the transportation table. It's the homeless table. How do we have this voice as the implementers? So we at Gensler decided to take videos, and I'll show you a video in a minute. But we said, why not make a quick video? Let's use Vimeo as a distribution network. And why don't we actually use our interns for research? And why don't we see what's important to everybody and get that message out? So again, with our intern group, we sat them up, and we ultimately said, what do you think we want to look at? And one of them said, you know what? What determines the maximum density of a city? The other intern looked over and said, the code, zoning, of course. We said, well, is that really true? Shouldn't we unpack that a little bit? Shouldn't we put that out there? And that's no different than many other objects. If you actually go onto Vimeo, you'll see we've put out about 30 or 40 videos talking about different things that we all should be concerned about with regards to cities. So this is a video that we produced with the interns. It is about 5 years old, so some of the data is a little bit dusty. But I think we've been able to really get a message out for all of us so that we really can change our cities and how we're living in them and what we're doing. So let's watch this video. So again, I want to just give you one example, and I really do believe it's the simple wins that count. It's the day-to-day, every one that adds up. In '07, we designed a project in Century City that was on an existing 6-acre below-grade 6-story parking structure. They were pumping 50,000 gallons of water a day out of that garage, and they were putting it to the storm system. So when we were redesigning the project, we said to the city, this is great, we're going to create a park, and we're going to use this water to irrigate the park. And the city said we couldn't do that because it wasn't deemed clean. Yet, in 2015, the city of Los Angeles changed the ordinance and said, with minor filtration, we now will allow you to irrigate that park off of that groundwater versus just pushing it down the storm system. So again, I think every day we're making a win here, a win there. With your help, we can design a better world. So thank you.
Great. How about thanking all of our panelists? So I think you can see why we have this panel. You have three people up here who have access to information. I want Jay to explain just briefly how you measure groundwater from satellites, because it's a fascinating story about a scale in reverse. But notice that they all then segued into, okay, we've got this evidence, quote unquote, the name of the panel. How do we convey it, either through our own means or through someone, a vehicle like the New York Times, or fascinatingly enough, going to new media channels like Vimeo and others. So Jay, talk a little bit about, just quickly, how you measure groundwater from space, and then talk about what you've been doing quite actively out there to translate what you know to the public, and how successful are you at it?
Okay, so the way we see groundwater from space has a lot to do with cannabis being legal. No, it's not it at all. We use this gravity-based satellite, and so it measures very accurately the tiny space-time variations in Earth's gravity field that are primarily driven by the movement of water over and through the land surface. It rains here, it evaporates there, it flows over the land into the ocean, evaporates, and this helps us weigh the different components of the water cycle. So having those measurements allows us to map, really for the first time, the regions of the Earth that are gaining or losing water mass, like you saw, and quantify the rates at which it's happening, like you saw in those. Like you saw in those graphics, and so the answer is not cannabis, but it's magic. Okay, it's magic. And the success part, so I've been doing a lot of communication, because that when you have access to information like that, I feel as a scientist, it's a responsibility to communicate what's going on. And so it's why I'm happy to be here at meetings like this, and did a lot of work in DC before I moved to Canada, where, as I mentioned, our cold is really awesome cold. It's a challenge. And I think in California, we had some success because of the confluence of a few things: the intensity of the drought, very environmentally focused government leadership with Jerry Brown and the State Water Board and Felicia Marcus. The media were focused on it. So Ian James is here. We've had many conversations, and even Abram and Noah are here. And so I've spoken with all these guys through the years. There's an intense focus on the West. So it was sort of taking advantage of the crisis. A lot of strong research happening throughout California. That was the state government really paid a lot of attention to it, and it sort of culminated in the passage of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which, as someone said before, maybe last night, was it's a pretty good thing to have that passed. So it takes an awful lot of work, and I think in our case, we were unfortunate because all those things were happening, but fortunate in terms of getting the message across. Now, I don't know what that means for the rest of the world, and do we need a series of crises and all of those hotspots to make a difference? I don't know.
So Trevor, almost picking up on the last comment I made on the panel that I moderated this morning, there are a lot of people writing about the challenges ahead of us, some saying we've passed certain thresholds, You can read those books. And your maps make it abundantly clear that we've got some challenges ahead. I remember that New York Times article. I clipped it immediately. I'm so glad to meet you now because it was powerful about the loss of GDP in the 10X quarter. You're obviously out there translating it. You know, this is difficult stuff. What's the reaction in your office? What you know is going to be perceived? How do you manage that? What do you hope comes out of it?
I mean, I think there are these moments where people who are not steeped in this research day to day are open for kind of deeper engagement on it, and whether that's because there's a flood going on in the Midwest or wildfires that just happened in California or a hurricane in the Southeast. And I think the key is to find a way as a research provider, to engage people in that moment, both in a way that makes them want to understand more about what this will mean for their community in the future, but also in a way that's empowering. Like, the challenge with doing research on climate is because it is so vast and can seem so apocalyptic, people's natural response mechanism is just to like compartmentalize it and shut it out. And so you have to both engage people in a way that is relevant to them, so their community, their pocketbooks, their kids.
It's what makes the hometown idea brilliant.
Right. But then you also have to like empower, like, what do you do with this information? Like, you as a individual, what do you do with this information? And that can be as small as, how do you think about which home you buy? So we do a lot of hurricane flood modeling and looking at how we can provide that kind of information to home buyers to evaluate what's the flood risk of home A versus home B, to how do I support local resilience efforts in my community. So right now in California, as we recover from wildfires of the past couple of years and deal with a bankrupt utility, how do we rebuild the electrical system in California that's more resilient? So finding areas for engagement locally that people can see tangible impact of what they're doing. And then the third is try to engage people through that lens in a conversation around climate policy at a much larger level. But all of that starts locally, and it starts with the impacts that people are feeling right now.
When people come to you, do they have a pretty good idea about what you're going to produce in terms of what the outcome will be? And I don't mean down to the last detail, but they have a sense that GDP is going to be reduced in the southern tier, but they don't have the evidence that maybe they need to convey it. Do they have a sense that they come to where things are headed, or are they surprised by what?
They're surprised. We're often surprised. This is in terms of if it's a large institution, anyone from the International Rescue Committee that we do work on climate conflict relationships with, to large asset management firms, they have no understanding generally when they start of the shape of what climate will mean in the areas in which they work, and we often are surprised too when we pursue that research, right? So as a kind of an example of that, we set out to research the relationship between temperature and violent crime rates. And there's an extremely tight statistical correlation between those two. And this is something that like any beat cop will say anecdotally, that when you have multiple very hot days, crime rates spike. But then when you walk all the way through the analysis, it turns out that while that statistical correlation is very tight, the magnitude is extremely small relative to all the other things that drive violent crime rates. So the answer there would be, if you're trying to think about crime prevention, you don't need to think about climate at all. All of these other factors matter a lot more. Whereas we might dig in on something where people don't think it's going to be as big of a deal, like the impact of climate on outdoor labor productivity. And it turns out that the economic magnitude is massive of that.
And by the way, I'm not going to keep coming back to you, Trevor, and I want to get the other two in. But over lunch, one of the speakers you'll hear tomorrow said, oh yeah, I can find a model or construct one to tell me just about anything I want. So you were talking about all the things that you add into some of those models. You're laying on this information. Obviously, that changes what comes out the other end with each little adjustment. How do you calibrate that properly so you're not fooling either yourselves or others by what you've put in or left out? Because the evidence, when it's presented in a map, is very compelling.
So this is one of the things that's different about our approach relative to the way people have done climate economics in the past, which is taking a couple of coarse-ish studies and some general intuition and then putting it into a kind of black box model. We have this excessive fidelity to empirical data. So all of these damage functions that we create are based on an empirical observed data and are reproducible by anyone else. So we make those raw data sets available, and any other data science team can go through it and find that exact same relationship. Into the future, so that's the relationship between like a hot day and an outcome. How the climate will change in the future, there is uncertainty across models. So the way that we deal with that is we use an entire ensemble. We take a model of models approach. So we take all 21 global climate models, and we always present people with a probability distribution of outcomes. And most of the folks that we work with are used to dealing with uncertainty. They're used to a range. They just want to bound. They want to know what is the, what's the likely range of outcomes, and then what are the tail risks, and we present them with both of those.
So Rob, your firm, and you may want a 30-second overview of Gensler. Describe your firm, and obviously you are interested in building. You're interested in projects. That's your bread and butter. You're producing something that says, it's not about FAR, it's about other things. How does that fit into the large repertoire of how Gensler sees itself, and what other things you might be drawn into as a result of those kind of findings and or illustrations?
Okay, well, I think what was great about this conversation that really started to occur was the notion of people first, right? Why are we doing what we're doing? It's about creating better environments for people, okay? And you really have to think about people and their habits. And I think so much of what we're talking about is research, but how do we drive that research into everyday life so people really change the way they live and what they do? And it's sort of a funny little example. I took someone from California back east, and they came out and they said, I put my hands under the sink for 5 minutes and the water would never come out. I didn't know what to do. I said, well, you have to turn the lever. And they're like, oh, we haven't had a lever in California in 20 years. So it's habits that's changed, right? So how do we, as a design firm, really take people and design facilities and great buildings around them? So we are a very, we hate to say large, but we're a large global firm. And what we really look at is communities and cultures. How can you be global but local? How are you deeply embedded into your community? How do you understand the needs and wants and desires of the communities? And I hate to say it, I think a lot of times a lot of architects will be into creating a really dramatic disruption and something that's really interesting. But you cannot be the size we are and just create disruption after disruption after disruption, because nobody wants to live in that kind of a city or that kind of a community, okay? So you're really getting down to understanding people first and what have been the trends. And I think when you really look, it's very simple. I grew up with depression parents. And so everything was about, he who has the most when he dies wins, right? And now we've created this thing called a millennial, and we're all looking at this millennial like it has 4 arms and 6 legs, and what is it? And the reality is, we created it, okay? But there's some really great things that they're not looking for stuff as much as they are looking for experiences. They're looking at life different. They're asking the questions we want them to be asking. So how do we redesign our communities? We did some really great things in our communities, but this flight to suburbia is a real problem, and it's a real issue, okay? And you look at the 4 phases of life, and I won't go through all this, but I think the biggest concern we should all have, how did we not design walkable communities? What is the single biggest issue for suburbia and the elderly? Loneliness. Because they're connected only by a car, and a lot of them can't drive. And so you take the mistakes we made, how do we redesign our communities, but then how do we take technology? The autonomous car, it's here. It's not coming, it's here, and it's going to come like a storm. And that's going to greatly impact our habits, our lives, our cities, and everything. So how do we just stay ahead of it and keep designing great communities?
So those of you who were not here last night, I'm sorry. We had a good party and a good discussion, and we kicked off with John Ross, purposely so. That was the intent, because he just wrote a book on John and Wesley Powell, who produced a map Arid Lands of the West in 1878, which clearly forecast many of the issues we have today and suggested how to inhabit the West, taking data that he gathered at his peril and put it into a map to try to convince Congress to think differently about the West. Based on what you've just heard, John, the resonance with that work, with Powell, how do you see it? And surely he would love to have some of the tools that Jay has and or Trevor has at his disposal. What would you say about the comparison?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this has been fascinating today. I hearken back to the time for the entire beginning of the first part of the Young Republic, almost right up to the Civil War. People looked out at the American West and knew it as a great American desert. That's what it was. People didn't really want to go there, go through it. It was a great American desert. Then virtually overnight, extraordinarily, it was flipped on its head, this concept. It's no longer a great American desert, but it was virtually an Eden. It was a place where you could have your fortune, you could have it all. And why did that happen? Well, there's this great example of this guy in Kansas. He was caught in a blizzard. He was, and in his pocket, he died. And in his pocket was a little flyer announcing that Kansas was the Switzerland of America. And the reason I bring this up is that things can change. Why did that change? Well, these were ideas about manifest destiny. These were the railroad barons who wanted to, support their development, their investment in the West to develop and get people out there. This was, about a bunch of various folks talking about scientific things. Rain follows the plow. I think I mentioned that. These kind of crazy scientific things. This whole new way that people came to understand the West very quickly drew millions and millions of people out to live out in the American West, putting their hopes on all of these wrong things, as it turned out, when the Dust Bowl and other things drove them away and started one of the largest migrations in American history. So I have some optimism that through data, but even regardless of the most wonderful data, the data has to have a story. And the story has to reach into the roots of who we are as Americans, what progress is, what the American dream is about. All of these things, it has to be tied to a story, which is why this is so hard. But I think we can find a way, with this incredible data we're seeing, with the stories we're beginning to tell, for people who don't devote themselves to this every day to understand, to change how they think, where they move, how they interact with their environment.
So questions from the audience. I'm sure you have some from these folks who clearly have access to information, data, and how they're accumulating it. Yes, sir.
Major issues, with redeveloping the urban cores of major cities is that when you get lots of people to move in from the suburbs with higher incomes, the lower income folks have been living in the inner city can't afford it anymore. You have gentrification, the people get kicked out and have a hard time finding another place to live. Do you see any kind of solution to that gentrification issue?
It'll be
I'm
good.
gonna solve
If he
that in about
does,
30
this
seconds.
conference has really got it going on.
No, well, first thing, I don't think it's as simple as that. And by that I'm saying, one of the facts a lot of us hold up with pride is the highest percentage of the population in the earth lives in urban centers than ever before on the earth. And so this urbanization or densification is only going to get greater. What's ultimately happened, I think, through the suburbanization of cities is the notion of what is a home and where do I stay has changed. And what is a home? Oh, it's this little, 1,800 square foot independent thing that everybody can afford and everybody can live in. But that's never been the case, never in America. And when you actually go back in the 40s and 50s and you look, San Francisco was known as the city of hotels. You start to look at SROs, you start to look at renting a bed for a night for $1, $2, right? Go to Europe when we were all kids, right? We stayed in hostels. But all of a sudden, we got rid of all the SROs. We got rid of all these beds that you could rent. We overzoned our cities. This is single-family residence. Well, but can I have a mother-in-law's apartment? No, you cannot. And so what we've done is we've removed everything that people who came into cities. Why are people leaving rural America? They're leaving rural America because they don't have jobs, right? Because we talk about mechanization. Well, mechanization happened at the farms years and years ago. So they're coming to the city, which is more expensive than rural areas. They don't have jobs, which means they don't have money. And where do we expect them to go? And what we've basically given them is the street. And that's what we've done. So do we have a lot of work to do? Yes. And it's not as simple. Unfortunately, we're involved in a lot of permanent supportive housing, and we just finished the bridge housing in Los Angeles. The problem with permanent supportive housing is everybody's designing around worst case, not best case. And worst case is the chronically ill. And so you start to say in California, and it's a real issue right now, when you're starting to say, we need bed, bath, kitchen for an individual. And in California, they're building these, and guess what? In Los Angeles, they're costing $550,000 a door, and in San Francisco, $750,000 a door. So I get to go back to my employees and say, look, I really, really do appreciate, we voted for this measure called HHH, and we agreed to tax ourselves so that we get $1.2 billion so that we could build 1,000 units of permanent supportive housing. Well, guess what? Or excuse me, 10,000. We didn't get there. We got to 3,000. We didn't get to 10,000. So it's not a big deal. I just need you to vote again so we can get another lift, so we can build more of these units. And they look at me and they go, I don't have a $500,000 house. Should I go put a tent in front of the office? And then will you give me one of those if I vote for this? So it's an issue. We have to figure out how to provide housing in ways that we haven't provided it. But honestly, if you look at the older models, we were much, much better. And for some reason, we've erased that memory. And we've created a model that is not a sustainable model. And this is not going to get better because more and more people are moving to cities, and not just in the United States, but all over the world. So we've got a big issue here, but I think we can tackle it.
Okay. I think there's a question right over there.
Suzanne Aiden, I'm from Tucson. And you have all made a point about making the public aware and giving information to the public so that they can understand the situation and change the culture. But I wonder if you can tell stories about putting the information in front of politicians. We have something of a disconnect on some issues like climate between people and their elected representatives. And I wonder if you have stories about direct contact with elected representatives on any level to present evidence and what kind of reaction you had.
Jay's found himself in the White House on more than one occasion. Maybe you could speak to your success there.
I think it really depends on the receptiveness of the particular politician. So my experience was one of making the rounds mainly to educate and to share some of this information. And you often end up speaking with a young staffer. I think we might have one in the audience today. And whether or not that information gets carried up to the boss, I think, is often dependent on the staffer. That said, I think my experience was again one of brute force. And over a long period of time, you figure out who's interested and who's not, and you build a network. And then, you have to. It's just like the conversations we had about stakeholder engagement. You have to build trust. So I never walked in there and said, "Hey, I need $5 million to go do this." It was much more, here's a new paper, here's a 1-page, or 2-paragraph synopsis. Just thought you should know. See you later. So in general, I would say it was positive, though.
John, this resonates with what Powell was all about it. Powell creates this extraordinary map saying, here's the West, as I found it, here's where the water is, here's where it isn't, shows it to Congress, didn't have much success. He didn't have success because people's interests were more immediate and all kinds of other things. The parallels between now and today?
Absolutely, just very resonant. And again, it was the forces of manifest destiny and success and American optimism that swept over very, very convincing data that was presented beautifully. And people aren't going to absorb the data if they're not ready to hear it. And, you know.
We've got just a couple more minutes. Rob wanted to respond to this as well.
As a designer, we're in the idea business. And so what we find is if you take a good idea to a politician, as long as you don't mind them claiming it's theirs, they'll take it. So we, for instance, Pershing Square is a big issue in Los Angeles. We created, again, another video like this and gave it to them. And again, it's amazing how that came out of the mayor's office 2 weeks later. So they really do want to do the right thing. And it's really understanding what are their issues and how do we create solutions and provide them the solutions.
Trevor, do you want to take a swing at that? And maybe we'll do one more question because I'm sure you have officials who are asking for information or your information winds up in others' hands and probably requires more interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, for elected officials, our experience has been there's two influence channels. One are through constituents, because elected officials are responsive to the people that vote for them. And the challenge there has just been that climate change has not been a priority issue for constituents. That has started changing over the past couple of years. The last 2 years of hurricanes and wildfires has made it a more salient issue for voters than it was before. But the other is actually connecting to the things that they as individuals care about. So really figuring out, doing your background research on what is it that that particular elected official cares about. Do they fish for trout? Do they have kids that live in South Florida that are at risk from hurricanes? And then there's really no substitute for field trips for elected officials. The data is the hook, but the field trips are the whatever that I can't finish that analogy, but the other part of fishing. And people generally get into politics because they're people, right? And so they are often data literate more than the average American, but that's not what animates most elected officials. What animates them are humans. And so seeing firsthand the impacts of changes can turn an elected official into an evangelist in a way that very few other things can, and where you'll actually often see some of the people who've been most forward-leaning on this topic, both on the Republican and the Democratic side, it was because their kid took them on a tour of Antarctica, or they had a family member who was directly impacted, and that sticks with them. And then you'll often see them spend political capital on this topic independent of what their constituents want, actually, because it is a motivating issue for them personally.
So I've got a bunch of zeros up there, but that was a nice hand wave, so we'll do this really quickly. How about right there?
Hi, I'm Amna, urban designer at SWA Group, and this question is really for Jay and Trevor. It seems that in both of your work, intentionally or unintentionally, the graphics and diagrams that you guys generate are really about eroding jurisdictional boundaries, a topic that we hit on earlier. Have you ever been prompted by an organization to kind of investigate that a little bit more deeply? Or even personally, if you want to look into redrawing boundaries in a way to graphically communicate the powerful impact that these investigations have?
Well, I certainly have had many requests to look at various regions to try to differentiate between some of the specifics between surface water and groundwater, and I do what I can to help and do that, and I think we sometimes have to get to the what the motivating, who's asking. And are we doing a service, or is someone out looking for financial gain? So it can't always comply. But it's a challenge, it really is a challenge to understand. You know, we're talking about these boundaries a little bit earlier. Looking at the difference between watersheds and aquifers and how they overlap is like a big problem that I have to contend with, and I get a lot of questions on.
Trevor.
We probably don't engage on that topic in the way that you're thinking of. Usually the geographic jurisdictional issues that we're grappling with are more on the international mass migration front. So we do a lot of research on climate-driven migration rates, and for European policymakers in particular, that same geographic heterogeneity of climate impacts that I showed for the U.S. is doubly true for the rest of the world. So the magnitude of impact in the Middle East and North Africa is a more order of magnitude higher than it is in Southern or Northern Europe. And if you're a European policymaker that's grappling with a refugee crisis today from Syria, thinking through how you're going to address a future where your immediate neighbors to the south are in increasingly inhabitable geographies is top of mind for a lot of European officials.
I'm glad we took that question. The whole point of the 10 Across projects, you don't see any state boundaries on our maps or other things. We think that what folks have in common at the moment, even though they might have very different geographies, is far more powerful than their circumstances on the ground. So I think it's overcoming boundaries. That's why we also had the panel right before lunch, is crucial in terms of thinking. We've just got to think at a different scale. So let me thank our panelists. I hope you will as well.